Welcome to the GEOTOP-A seminar. Today's speaker is Grosberg, who's going to tell us, is the trivial knot really so trivial? Shura, take it away.
Thank you, David. Thank you for inviting me to speak at your seminar. I will try to tell you the story, which is very uneven. I will start from a rather elementary introduction to the ideas which are pretty old and probably widely known, but then I will rather rapidly climb up and come to the ideas which are very new and published only less than a year ago, and very much based on physics intuition and physics arguments and so on. So let me start by showing to you the picture that all of you have seen many, many times, and I will be mostly speaking about this guy, the trivial knot. Notice that Tate, 2 centuries ago, didn't even bother to draw a trivial knot because he thought, wow, that's not a knot at all, so it's not interesting. So for me, being polymer physicist, I view this object as an interesting object. This is not a, although it's called trivial knot, but this, as I am going to show, is not a trivial object at all. So as a warm-up, these polymer chains do exist in the form of rings, and some of these rings are trivial knots. Not all of them. There are rings which are not trivial knots, but I will concentrate on polymer rings which are trivial knots. And as you see in the cartoon on the left, it is shown as just a planar circle. In reality, in electron microscopy image on the right, you see that this polymer is wiggling, is very flexible. And this is the major subject of study. How fluctuations, flexibility of the polymer is related to the fact that it is topologically constrained to be a trivial knot. My main tool to characterize what happens to these polymers will be so-called gyration radius, which is defined for every object, not even necessarily for a polymer. If you have n points in space with position vectors Ri, then this is gyration radius of this cloud of points. And this formula, by the way, belongs to nobody lesser than Lagrange. So it's basically the gyration radius is the average mean square distance between pairs of points. So if your polymer chain or polymer loop is completely unrestricted, so-called Gaussian random walk, then gyration radius mean square. Gyration radius is linear in the number of units, number of monomers, and is given by this formula. For the loop, it is 2 times smaller than for linear random walk, because of course ends are connected to one another. So it is very easy and very trivial. Slightly less trivial, actually significantly less trivial, is the statement that self-avoiding walk that cannot visit twice or more than twice one is the same place, its gyration radius is also a power law function of the number of monomers, and the power here, which is related to fractal dimension of the object, is roughly 0.6. This is also a well-known fact. I want to emphasize that actually this gyration radius is a very, very strongly fluctuating quantity. The probability distribution of it is computed, is known, and this is this probability distribution here. Although at large distances the decay is exponential, but you see that it is a wide distribution. There is no other scale. It is not that all of the trajectories have gyration radius close to the mean. They have fluctuations which are of the same scale as the mean. So it's very large fluctuations. And as I will discuss in my talk, I will be speaking about very far tail of this distribution. Unknots, as I will show, belong to the very far tail of this distribution. So this this fact that they belong to the far tail of the distribution, this fact is a direct consequence of the classical theorem. David, who is our chair today, is one of the authors of this statement. And this statement is formulated right here on the screen. It says that the probability, you can see the fraction of trivial knots among all possible polygons is exponentially small with the number of sides of this polygon or the number of vertices in the polygon. From physics point of view, you can say that this formula indicates that if you want to imagine your knots to be in thermodynamic equilibrium and you want to perform work, untying all the knots, then the amount of work that you have to perform would be linearly dependent on the length of your polymer. There is this parameter n naught. This parameter n naught, there is no mathematical way to compute it as far as I know, but numerically there are many ways to do it, to find this n naught, and it is surprisingly large. It's several hundred. Depending on the type of the polygon, on the distribution of the length of the sides of this polygon, you obtain quantities in the order of 300, 200, something of this sort. So it's a large quantity. But the important point, which is also very well known and well recognized, is that this formula indicates that standard mathematical tools for description of random walks cannot apply for trivial knots, such as, for instance, diffusion equation, field theory, and so on. All of them do not apply because, of course, standard random walk is a limit in which the number of segments goes to infinity and the size of the segment goes to 0, such that this combination n times b squared remains finite. This is the limit, and in this limit there are no trivial knots at all. So therefore, this is important to realize that unknots are not the subject that can be described by diffusion equation or any machinery like this. So they live in the very far tail of the probability distribution. So if that is the case, then one question that was also asked many years ago is, suppose that we have one single unknot that freely fluctuates in empty space. So what is the gyration radius of this object? So the answer is interesting, and it is formulated here. As long as the number of monomers is small compared to this parameter n naught, then it is basically Gaussian object. Because these loops, they don't want to make any knots, and therefore they behave essentially. The fact that it's a trivial knot does not restrict their fluctuations. However, when chain length becomes longer, then surprisingly, this object, although intrinsically it doesn't have any excluded volume, it is not self-avoiding. It is only not avoiding, so to speak. It is trivial knot, but otherwise has no other exclusions. Its size, its gyration radius, on average, starts behaving with the same power as is known for self-avoiding quarks, and this is shown here. Again, I show here an old data from my own student Nathan Moore, but there are many other data, not any worse. This one is just simpler for me to find this picture. So Moore is not the only one who observed this. So the point is, because this, the fact that the loop is an unknot pushes it to the very far corner of the phase space. In that corner of the phase space, conditional average gyration radius behaves in this very non-trivial way. Let's now look in a different way. Let's imagine what happens if we, instead of allowing our polymer to fluctuate in empty space, let's imagine that we take an unknot and squeeze it, make it as compacted as possible. So in that case, I cannot anymore assume that it is not self-avoiding, so it is now self-avoiding, and I imagine that I compact it to the minimal volume that is possible, which means I can imagine, for instance, on the lattice that every unit, every monomer occupies one side of the lattice, and there are no empty places. So this brings me to the realm of another branch of mathematics, to space-filling curves. And in that case, space-filling curves in 2D, or I'm showing here some examples. That's okay, but in 3D, the most famous example of the space-filling curve in 3D is due to David Hilbert, and then later Moore invented the closed form, the unknot, the loop, which is space-filling, and this is constructed in this hierarchical way, which is well known. Now, the fact of the matter is that it's not unique. There are many Hilbert-like curves that you can construct by placing these cubes in different orientations in different places on all possible scales. So there are many of them. There are exponentially many of them. And they are all unknots. By construction, they are all unknots. So you can start looking at something happened here. For some reason, my PowerPoint presentation doesn't want me to move to the next slide. It showed another two-dimensional space-filling curve, which is made on the leaf by some bug. The bug obviously was eating the leaf and made a leaf-filling curve, space-filling curve, just funny thing. Okay, so now it works. All right, so let us look at this space-filling curve, or in other words, Hamiltonian walk on this graph, which is an unknot, Hamiltonian unknot. So let's look a little more closely at the properties of this Hamiltonian unknot. So let's go deep inside this mess, and let's choose a subchain, a piece of chain of some S monomers, somewhere in the middle. First of all, I can ask what is the size of this little subchain in the middle. So I would claim that the size grows with the number of monomers in this subchain to the power nu, which is 1/3, which means it is not only the whole thing is space filling, but every piece of it is space filling. It is compact in itself. Now you can ask another question. So again, I look at this piece, S monomers somewhere in the middle, and I am asking how many of these monomers are in contact with other monomers of that same subchain versus how many of these monomers are in contact with somebody else. For instance, imagine that I look at this red piece. By the way, this polymer here is colored from red end through the whole rainbow to the violet end at the other end. So these two ends are connected. It is a loop. So imagine that I look at the red piece. So I am asking how many of the red monomers are in contact with other red monomers here inside the red piece, and others are maybe in contact with green or with orange or with blue and so on. So how many of them are on the surface, in other words? So it turns out that it is a power law function of S, and this parameter, this index beta, characterizes roughness of the surface. If surface is smooth, and for Hilbert curve shown here, surface is smooth and beta is 2/3, right? Beta is 2/3. But for others, surfaces may not be so smooth as my picture here shows. You see, it's computer-generated picture, and surfaces here are not smooth at all. So beta is not 2/3, but perhaps a bigger number. Now there is yet another power, gamma, which characterizes the following. Again, I consider a subchain of S monomers, and I consider the probability that two ends of this subchain are actually next to one another in space. This probability decays with S as S to minus power gamma, and I can prove a theorem. I will not prove it, but take my word for it. It's published, it's an old result, that beta plus gamma is 2. So if beta, for instance, is 2/3, when it's smooth surface for Hilbert curve, it's 2/3, and then gamma is 4/3. Now, my student Smrek, with important contribution by Eretz Lieberman-Eiden via some discussion at the beginning, so Jan Smrek proved the following theorem. He proved that there exist space-filling unknots with any value of gamma that you want between 3/2 and 1. It is an interesting theorem in its own right, and it's proven by explicit construction. He was able to construct specifically for any value of gamma or any value of beta. He was able to construct the curve. an interesting, I will not speak about this, but an interesting fact is that this power gamma is actually experimentally measured. The point is, to some extent, chromosomes in which our DNA is packed, these chromosomes contain DNA which sort of forms a space filling curve. It is a dense object, very long filament, and this is a sort of a space filling curve. So it turns out, I will not explain how it is done, but it turns out that for these objects, power gamma can be measured. So this probability P of S, experimentally measured, is shown here in this picture, and these different colors correspond to different biological species, and you see that the power gamma is different for different biological species. This is super interesting and the subject of a different talk. I will not speak about it, just to mention that this is not, apart from interesting mathematical game, there is something important there too. So the point that I want to make is that there exist curves with any gamma you want, but it is not known what are the corresponding entropies, which means what if you take a random space filling curve, what kind of gamma do you most likely obtain? It is not known, and I do not know the answer to that question. There are people, like in this paper by these people in Makayev, Churin, Nechayev, and Mirny, they simulated on a large lattice, they simulated an exactly this process of compaction of a very long unknotted loop. You see that it looks somewhat similar to this unknotted Hilbert curve in the sense that it's territorial. The piece, when it's colored, like I described, from one end to another by rainbow colors, you see that there is red territory, green territory, blue territory, and so on. So similarly, it's here. And if you consider topology blind polymer chain, then it's not territorial. All the colors are mixed together. This is an interesting observation, and it would be interesting to have mathematical proof of it. And in general, for this space filling globules, as polymer physicists call them, there are several properties which are related to one another, but we don't know if this indicates that there is only one universality class of this collapsed unknots, or there are several different universality classes. We don't know. I should also mention that some of my friends indicated here, Kirill Palovnikov, Sergei Nechayev, and Misha Tam, they invented an interesting, exactly solvable model that generates trajectories with fractal dimension 3. I just mentioned it. Will not develop any depth. So it's just a possibility to look at the problem. Okay, so this is all I wanted to tell you about a single loop. And now let's go up in complexity and consider multiple loops. To this end, the simplest problem was first addressed in polymer physics context by Sam Edwards, although it was based on earlier mathematical studies by Spitzer. Also Prager and Frisch did similar things. So this is to consider one loop like this, and another loop is basically an infinite spike that goes from one end to another. So this is a caricature of a simpler, of physically more appealing problem of two loops. And basically what happens when you have two loops, if they are unconcatenated, it is also a topological constraint, and they sort of repel each other for topological reasons. This is physically quite obvious. They do repel each other. It's observed in simulation, in experiment, and so on. It's nice. But what happens if you have many loops? Similar to how I described to you Hilbert curve, which is an unknot, which is space filling. I can now imagine a space filling set of many unknots which are mutually unconcatenated. So again, it's not only trivial knot, but also a trivial link. Unconcatenated, unknotted loops, which are, it's in polymer physics language, it's called melt, and it is simply space filling mass of many loops. So quite surprisingly, what happens is the following. So what I'm showing to you here is the result of computer simulation performed by these people, Kurt Kramer and John Halvorson. And what happens here is the following. So what you see on the left is one single linear polymer chain, and on the right is one single loop. But in the background, the black field, what you don't see is that it's the space which is full of other linear chains on the left and of other rings on the right. Otherwise, it's the same thing, same size, same everything, and you see that the shape of the chain and of loop is dramatically different. Loop more or less stays as a compact object. It does not allow other loops to get into it. And this guy is actually, it's very close to Gaussian random walk. It fluctuates as a Gaussian random walk. So individual ring in the sea of others is a space filling curve on average. Indeed, if you make a plot of gyration radius, normalized in peculiar way, gyration radius as a function of n, the length of the chain, then at long length, you do obtain this power. This slope is the power of 1/3. This is the compact scaling that you have. Although there is a very wide crossover, and the nature of this crossover is an interesting subject of investigation, and I would say it's not completely understood yet. There are some interesting and deep issues about this crossover that I will not speak about. And by the way, there is also the important role of so-called entanglement length that is important in repetition theory due to Dejean and Edwards. Again, let me skip it because I cannot otherwise come to everything else that I wanted to tell you. So when you are, so we conclude that every chain, every ring in the melt of rings is actually a space filling curve on its own. although with non-smooth boundaries. It is filling space, but it's not filling a cube with smooth boundaries. It fills some irregularly shaped domain, like in this picture. And so these domains have their surface roughness exponent beta. They have, each domain has its contact probability exponent gamma. In addition, when you have these irregularly shaped rings, you can actually construct a minimal surface spanned on every ring. And you can ask what is the scaling of minimal surface with the number of monomers. There was computation by my student, former student Jan Smrek, and he showed that this power x is very close to 1, which it's an interesting object, interesting geometry, how to imagine a loop whose spanning minimal surface scales linearly with the length of the loop. So there are lots of open questions here. In particular, I'm telling you about various power law exponents, but of course, there are finite size corrections to these scaling laws, and these finite size corrections are very poorly understood. There are many open questions here. Okay, so half an hour is gone, and now I start doing something. I start increasing the physics content very rapidly, and will be going through much more recent results. Namely, before I was talking about static properties of all these unknots, unconcatenated rings, and so on. Static properties, geometrical properties, all controlled by the fact that there are topological constraints. Now I want to know what happens if I subject these rings to some sort of external drive. Namely, this polymeric material, this set of rings, is polymer liquid, so it can flow. I can subject it to flow. And there are different types of flow, and experimentally it's possible to do either so-called shear flow or elongation flow. In shear flow case, you should imagine that this space here is filled with this liquid of polymer rings, and I move upper plate with respect to the lower plate while they remain parallel. In the elongation case, I do it maybe like this, or maybe it's easier to imagine that I have a piece of material. So this neck here is my set of many polymer rings, which are unknotted and unconcatenated, and I pull this piece of material like this. So it's called elongation. So in elongation flow, and the question what will these rings do when the liquid is subjected to such a motion? How do topological constraints, which are there and unbreakable, how do these topological constraints affect the motion of rings? So in this paper in the year 2020, these people, Gary Grest, Michael Rubinstein, Tim Gay, and Thomas O'Connor, they observed by computer simulation that in this type of elongation flow, what happens is rings start forming this interesting. I actually I prepared. I don't know. Can you see it? It's probably impossible to see. I have here rubber bands which I took from supermarket. In supermarket, some stuff is connected by this rubber band. So I can manipulate it, but it's probably difficult to see. So look at this photograph. In the photograph, I took two rubber bands, and you see how they can be connected. It is also shown here in this diagram. Okay. So furthermore, if you connect two of them, then you can connect the third one. And if you have this type of arrangement for two loops, and you can attach the third loop also. So you can start building the chain of these loops. The chain of loops, and of course, this chain of loops will now hold the force. It is elastic. You can pull, it will never decouple. So this leads to dramatic exchange of viscosity. And this is something that never happens without topological constraint. It's purely topological increase of viscosity. This is an extensional flow. How about shear flow? If we subject the rings to the shear flow. Shear flow, like this, the behavior of rings is very, very different. This is the picture. This is one of the rings inside this shear flow, and you see that it is dramatically elongated along the shear flow. So this is a picture, this is actually a cartoon, and this is the result of actual computer simulation. This is the reference for the paper, which is a very big paper in which several people are experimentalists led by Dimitris Vlasopoulos. Several people are simulation experts led by Kurt Kremer and Gary Grest. And several people, including myself and my student Vati Srinin, are theorists. So it's a big collaboration. And the story is the following. If you just simply measure viscosity by either experiment or by simulation, and you measure viscosity as a function of applied shear rate. It's plotted here as a function of Weisenberg number, which is essentially shear rate gamma dot, normalized by the relaxation time of every ring. So you see that at small shear rate, you have some viscosity, and then your viscosity gets smaller and smaller. Qualitatively, why it gets smaller? It gets smaller because chains, rather rings become elongated, and they can easily slide past one another. Elongated objects, they slide past one another. They are not bumpy. They are easier passing by one another. So it goes down. How does it go down? Usually it is described by the equation like this, and therefore at large Weisenberg number, at large shear rate, viscosity goes down as some power law, as you see here in this semi-locked plot. And we can estimate this power law based on essentially starting from this Maxwell relation. As I told you, I will have to increase dramatically my the reliance on your knowledge of various things, and I don't have time to explain many details here, including this Maxwell relation for viscosity related to stress relaxation modulus. And in linear response, this integration over time goes only to relaxation time, while in nonlinear case, it goes, instead of relaxation time, it goes to only the time that is 1 over shear rate. And this leads to the prediction that this power law by which this decays should be this minus 4/7. It's in a nonlinear response, and you see that it works. Basically, it works up to maybe one number of the order of 10. You have here very decent agreement of your data, both experimental data and simulation data. Beautifully, they collapse together. This all works down. But if you go to Weinberg number much larger, then there are some deviations. It doesn't work quite that well, which is why we call this scaling theory naive theory. So we had to develop a more sophisticated theory in which, unlike naive scaling that is presented here, we see that there are actually two different length scales involved. One is we call it shear blob, and this shear blob is a chain section whose relaxation time is controlled by the shear rate, and it is 1 over gamma dot. When you have this strong shear, then your chain is actually stretched. And when it is stretched, then it actually separates into so-called tension blobs or Pincus blobs. And it turns out that these Pincus blobs, there was a long story in which people assumed somehow that these blobs should be the same thing. And it is not. The main result here, the main insight, is that these two things are different. And we developed the relation between these and all this. And as a result, we constructed the following much less trivial relation between viscosity and the shear rate, which gives a better description of the whole situation. So apart from beautiful collapse of the data, my point here is that when the situation is so nonlinear, and when there is very strong shear force, then there are two different length scales. One length scale is the shear blob, whose size is determined such that relaxation time of the shear blob is controlled by the shear rate. And another is the Pincus blob, which is related to the fact that the shear forces, you see this red ring, it is subjected to drag force to the right on the top from the neighbors. Neighbors are passing by, they are sliding by, and they exert force on this red probe chain, and these neighbors from below exert force in this direction, because neighbors from below, they move a little bit with velocity to the left relative to red chain, neighbors from above with velocity to the right, and therefore there is this drag force, and this drag force pulls on the chain, and you can actually develop this simple relation between tension and shear, because you have the size of your shear blob, the size of shear blob, the width of this red probe chain, multiplied by gamma dot will be the relative velocity between upper and lower sides of this thing, multiplied by the friction coefficient of the shear blob, multiplied by the number of shear blobs. This is the force. This is the stretching force. And this is equal temperature divided by the size of the tension blob. So this is the relation between these two blobs. Based on this relation, we develop everything else, and we develop this result for the viscosity. Which again, you see there are data for experiments, there are data for simulations, and so on. So this is all. I was speaking for 46 minutes, and I think it is enough. So this is a set of some pictures from my talk. I want to acknowledge collaboration with several colleagues: Kurt Kremer, Nathan Moore, Sergei Nechayev, Itzhak Rabin, Michael Rubinstein, Jan Smrek, Vati Srinin, and I want to thank you for attention. I, of course, will be glad to answer any questions you have, or try to answer.
This was a terrific talk. So the floor is open for some questions, please.
Hello, sure. I found your talk extremely interesting and very beautiful. I have very simple questions. First of all, just a little note on history. You mentioned Lagrange at the very beginning of your talk about gyration radius. Can you
Yes.
can you give me some information? What is the interest of Lagrange on this? Or certainly not on this, but in relation to the gyration. And then let me ask you one more thing, and is do you have any information about any work on space filling curves in a torus rather than just Euclidean 3D? Thank you.
Okay, so the first question, thank you, of course, thank you. The first question is a simple one. Yes, maybe I should go to this formula. It is indeed surprising that Lagrange has anything to do with it, but he did. So this is gyration radius. So naively, you would say that gyration, how do you define gyration radius? You would start computing center of mass point of your, and then find the distances from all points to center of mass. So as you see, this formula, my formula, or not my, Lagrange formula, does not contain any center of mass. So this transformation from the most simple definition based on center of mass to this definition was developed by Lagrange. This is what Lagrange did. I must admit that I did not read Lagrange himself. I know the book by Flory, in which there is an appendix in which Flory derived this formula and says that it belongs to Lagrange. So I took Flory's word for it. Okay, so this is Lagrange, and your second question about torus. Super interesting question. Yes, super interesting question. So the question is, in this picture. So in this picture, what these people did is they placed their unknot inside a cube. they could, as we physicists say, they could have imposed periodic boundary conditions in all three directions, which would mean that it is now on the torus. So there is a difference. There is a significant difference. Why there is a difference is because when you have cube, that means you insist that your surfaces are smooth. At least outer surfaces are smooth. And you see there is this power beta, which characterizes smoothness of internal boundaries between domains. If you do it on the surface, then of course, so to speak, outer surface, this side will be glued to the other side, and therefore they can internally interpenetrate, and the surface does not have to be smooth. So it turns out that on the torus, all surfaces are characterized by the same power beta. So in this sense, on the torus, it's cleaner. The scaling is cleaner. It's better in this sense. And a situation on the torus is more similar to this situation when you have many of these rings that interpenetrate.
Well, thank you. Indeed, it was connected with what I assumed was the periodic box in the simulation. So that was the connection. By the way, going back to the slide on the gyration ranges, when you show the chains versus loops, by chains you mean uncatenated rings?
No, open polygon.
Okay.
Open. So this loop is just a polygon, n-gon, and these chains are open polygon. It's n vectors without the condition that two ends are in the same place.
Thank you.
And this blue curve was computed by Marshall Fixman much before me. But
Thanks.
the red curve was computed by Nathan Moore.
Sure, you showed some pictures of chains of loops. You had photographs of, 2 or 3 loops together. How long do those chains become?
In simulation, in this photograph, I can make it as long as you want, as long as it is only limited how many rubber bands I can borrow from local supermarket. But in simulation, I think that the longest that they have seen is 5. But I don't see why it should be limited by. In reality, in experimental reality, it may be very, very long. I don't know if it is. It has to be limited by anything.
So is it somehow a function of the size of the rings, the average length or something like that?
It is probably, well, most direct answer is I don't know, but my guess is that eventually it is limited by the system size. It will grow until it gets to the system size. So it's basically controlled by the size of this sample, I think. But of course, how rapidly or how easily it is formed will also probably depend on the on the ring size. If rings are very, very, very long, then maybe it will be difficult to.
Yeah,
I am speculating now.
very interesting. I was also very interested in the slide that you showed where the contact probability gamma depended in biology, depended on the species.
Yes, it does.
I'd never seen that one. Where are humans in this picture?
Okay, humans are this red curve. The red curve here. The blue curve is mouse. The orange curve is Drosophila. And green curve is
I think it's yeast, Shura, probably, right?
yeah, it is yeast. Yes, yes, yeah. Thank you, Christian. Yes, it is yeast. Yes. So yeah, it is. I have to tell you, it is a huge field. Chromosome folding. It's a huge field where people study all these bumps in these curves, and this is pretty old pictures that I showed to you. People study these curves to great details. There are many bumps, and apart from scaling, there are many interesting features in this curve. People study them. Job Decker is the inventor of so-called high-C experimental method, which allows to make this measurement. And this is a huge scientific achievement. In my opinion, he is a sure candidate for Nobel Prize. Job Decker. And this picture, of course, has beautiful physical sort of explanation, because this yeast curve it is, you see, it ends sooner. It ends sooner because yeast has shorter DNA than we do. And yeast has shorter DNA than we do by a factor of 100. And we should not be particularly proud of it, because it's not that yeast, it's not that we are more clever and we have more genes. Yeast has roughly the same number of genes that we do, but we have actually 99% of our DNA is not genes, it's not coding DNA, but something else. Used to be called junk DNA. It's not called junk anymore, but I don't know what it is. In any case, it's not genes, and for that reason, our DNA is 100 times longer than that of yeast. And for this reason, actually, yeast DNA is short enough such that it can reptate within a reasonable time. By reptation, it can essentially negate its topological constraints. While our DNA is too long to reptate, and it cannot reptate, the reptation time is proportional to polymer length to the power 3.5. So if you increase polymer length by a factor of 100 and raise this 100 to the power 3.5, you obtain 7 orders of magnitude. So our DNA reptates 10 million times slower than yeast, which is why topological constraints are important for it. And so that's why we are here. But this is a different talk altogether, and this is just different story.
Sure. I have another question, if I may. Have you ever attempted to compare some of your results, especially the when you study the linear nonlinear response of viscosity against the monomers with the turbulence studies? I do remember Alexander Chorin in Berkeley some time ago, a few years back actually, proposed a theory of turbulence based on elastic strings in a kind of viscous fluid. Some of your exponents would trigger some interest. That's why I'm asking that.
Yeah, indeed. In turbulence, of course, since Kolmogorov, scaling, cascades, and so on are very popular in studies of turbulence. There is a book by Kerzon Huang, in which he makes explicit comparison between polymer scaling and scaling in turbulence, and makes some speculations about the connection. I must admit, honestly, that I read it several times and I didn't understand it. So I am reporting to you that such thing exists. What it is, I don't know. That's my answer to this.
Sure. Of course, I know. There is a lot of skepticism on.
No, it's not skepticism. I didn't understand. It's.
No. I said that.
If you want, it's a skepticism about myself. It's.
No. Well, okay. Thank you.
Yes, I know there's some other questions. Christian.
Yes, I wish to ask Shura, towards the end of the presentation, I think probably at the very end, you showed a universal curve where you had the data about the shear flow that were all falling nicely in a plot where I think one of the parameters was the N over NE. Yes, exactly. This one here. So a curiosity. The data here coming from simulations, were those obtained for rings that are fully flexible? Have you or people explored also introducing bending rigidity? I understand that asymptotically you would expect N over NE to work anyway as a good parameter, but maybe the corrections to scaling can be large if you switch on a bending rigidity. Any interesting physics there?
No, we did not invest. I should not say we, because it's basically Gary Grest and Kurt Kremer who did these simulations. No systematic study of rigidity was not performed in this connection. It is attractive, sure. I would naively expect that, of course, the rigid chains will be less viscous, but no systematic studies of this subject was performed. Of course, if you want to do it, then NE will be different. NE itself, of course, will depend on entanglement length, will depend on rigidity.
Thanks.
Any other questions for Shura?
Here, of course, what drives me crazy is the fact that simulation and experiment are in such an agreement with each other. That's the idea that simulation is something real.
Okay, so if there are no other questions, sure, we thank you very much for a great talk.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for questions and thank you for listening. Thank you.